Hey everyone, and welcome to this deep dive. We've got some really interesting stuff to look at today. We're going to be taking a deep dive into the book of Jeremiah, chapters 30 through 33 to be exact. So, these chapters are just packed with prophecies and promises and this really powerful message of hope that I think still speaks to us even today.
Yeah, it's fascinating how these chapters come right after. Some pretty intense warnings and pronouncements of judgment from Jeremiah. Like it's this sudden shift to consolation that makes it all the more striking.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's like
Oh,
stepping out of a storm into this like ray of sunshine. And speaking of sunshine, Jeremiah 30 is literally titled the Book of Consolation. So what's the significance of that title coming on the heels of those previous chapters?
Well, it's specifically addressed to the people of Israel and Judah, who are going through some incredibly difficult times. And God is declaring that he will restore their fortunes and bring them back to their land. It's like this beacon of hope amidst all the exile and uncertainty.
Okay, so there's this promise of restoration. But then verse 7 also talks about this, like time of trouble for Jacob, which doesn't exactly sound all that comforting. So how do we reconcile these two ideas?
Well, it's acknowledging the very real suffering that they were going through. But the crucial part is that second half of that verse that says, but I will deliver them. God's not turning a blind eye to their pain. He's promising to break the yoke of oppression.
Yeah.
To actively set them free.
Oh, so it's not just about like, waiting for things to get better, but that God is actively involved in that process of deliverance. And I think we've all felt that yoke at some point in our lives, like those burdens or those struggles that just weigh us down. So what do you think that process of liberation looks like, both for the Israelites back then and then, for us today? What role do we play in it?
That's a great question. Well, for the Israelites, it ultimately involved returning to their homeland and rebuilding their lives and their communities. But it went beyond just like a physical relocation, right? It was a spiritual homecoming, like a return to a right relationship with God. And I think that's really the key for us as well. We experience brokenness in so many ways. In our relationships, our sense of purpose, our connection with God. True liberation involves allowing God to like heal those broken parts of ourselves, to bring us back into alignment with him.
It sounds like that. Internal transformation is a crucial part of this whole idea of restoration.
Absolutely. And that's where the new covenant comes in, introduced in Jeremiah 31. This isn't just like a change in rules. It's a fundamental shift in how we relate to God.
Okay, so could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah.
When we talk about a covenant in this context, what does that really mean?
Well, you can think of it as like a sacred agreement, like a binding promise that goes way deeper than just like following external laws. It really gets to the core of who we are. Jeremiah 31.31 says, God will put my law in their minds and write it on their hearts. It's not about checking off a list anymore, but it's an internal transformation that changes us from the inside out.
I see how that ties into the idea of internal restoration that we were just talking about.
Yeah.
It's not just about what we do, but about who we are at our core. So if God's law is like written on our hearts, how does that change the way that we view obedience? Does it become less about following these like external rules and more about just aligning our very being with God's will?
That's a great way to put it. And this transformation is rooted in love. Verse 3 says, I have loved you with an everlasting love. I have drawn you with unfailing kindness. So this love is the very foundation of that new covenant. And it's not just for people back then, it's a promise that continues to resonate with us today.
That's incredible. So we've got this overarching theme of restoration, this beautiful idea of the new covenant based on God's love. And then we jump to Jeremiah 32, and things take kind of a turn. We're in the middle of a siege, Jerusalem is surrounded, and the situation looks pretty dire. So what does God tell Jeremiah to do? In the midst of all this chaos, he tells him to buy a field.
Yeah, you're right. It seems almost counterintuitive, right? Like, why would you invest in land when everything around you is crumbling? But that's precisely the point. It's a bold act of faith, a powerful symbol of hope during a time of despair.
It's like saying, I trust you, God, even though I don't understand what's happening right now. So what do you think that act of buying the field revealed about God's character to the Israelites?
Well, in Jeremiah 32.43, it says, houses, fields, and vineyards will again be bought in this land. So this wasn't just like a real estate transaction. It was a prophecy of restoration, a declaration that even though things looked bleak, God's promises would prevail. It showed them that even in the direst circumstances, God is still in control and working to bring about his purposes.
That's a powerful image. And it reminds us that, even in our own lives, when things feel uncertain, we can choose to trust in God's bigger plan, even when we can't see the whole picture. Have you ever experienced something like that? where you had to hold on to hope in a situation that just seemed hopeless.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we all go through those moments where our faith is really tested. And it's in those times, when we choose to believe, even when we don't fully understand, that our faith grows the deepest roots.
And that brings us to Jeremiah 33, which starts with this amazing invitation. It says, "Call to me and I will answer you and tell you great and unsearchable things you do not know." I mean, who wouldn't want to hear about unsearchable things, right? It's like being offered a glimpse into the mysteries of the universe.
Mm.
So what do you think is the significance of this invitation? Why is God offering to reveal these hidden things?
Well, it acknowledges that we're limited in our human understanding, but that God's wisdom is infinite. He wants to open our minds to things that are beyond our comprehension. It's a reminder that he's not distant or aloof, but actively involved in our lives, desiring to guide us and to speak to our hearts.
So it's not just about receiving information, but about deepening our relationship with God. It makes me think of that moment when Jeremiah was told to buy that field. It seemed crazy at the time, but it revealed this deeper truth about God's faithfulness and his plan for restoration. And now in Jeremiah 33, we have this incredible invitation to tap into that same wisdom and guidance.
Exactly. It reminds us that God's ways are not always our ways. He sees the bigger picture, and he's always working for our good even when we can't understand his plans.
Okay, so we've got this invitation to uncover these unsearchable things. And there's one unsearchable thing in this chapter that becomes pretty searchable, and that's the mention of this righteous branch. So do you want to unpack that one for us?
Sure. So Jeremiah 33.15 says, "In those days and at that time I will make a righteous branch sprout from David's line." This is a key prophecy pointing to Jesus Christ. It speaks of ultimate restoration, this hope that extends far beyond the immediate situation in Jeremiah's time.
It sounds like even within these prophecies of restoration for Israel and Judah, there's this hint of something much bigger, something with implications for all of humanity.
Absolutely. That's what makes these chapters so profound. They address both our personal struggles and the grand narrative of God's redemptive plan for the world.
That's incredible. We've covered a lot of ground in these first few chapters.
Yeah.
And it's clear that there's still so much more to explore.
Yeah, it really is amazing how these chapters weave together like the immediate struggles of Jeremiah's time with this much broader, cosmic scope of hope.
Yeah, it really is. And that righteous branch prophecy pointing to Jesus is the perfect example of that. Connecting those Old Testament promises to their fulfillment in the New Testament, it links Jeremiah's time to our own in this really profound way.
Exactly. And that brings us back to this idea of restoration, which is so central to these chapters. So what does it actually look like? Not just for those living in Jeremiah's time, but for us today.
That is a great question. It's easy to get caught up in the historical context and miss the personal application.
Right. Well, for the Israelites, restoration involved returning to their homeland, rebuilding their lives and their communities. But it also held this deeper spiritual dimension. It signified a renewed relationship with God, like a turning back to him with their whole hearts.
So it wasn't just about going back to a physical place, but this internal homecoming as well.
Precisely. And that's a really powerful message for us today. We experience brokenness in so many different ways, but these chapters offer this promise of healing, of wholeness, of being made new.
It's interesting how that theme of restoration connects to the new covenant that we discussed earlier. They seem so intertwined.
Oh, absolutely. The new covenant is the very foundation of true restoration. It's not about trying to earn God's favor through rituals or rules, but about receiving his grace and allowing his love to transform us from within.
Okay, I'm with you so far. But how does this new covenant actually play out in our lives practically? It's one thing to kind of grasp the theory, but how do we actually experience this transformation?
Well, it begins with recognizing our need for God's grace. We can't restore ourselves on our own. We need his forgiveness, his healing power, and his guidance to navigate, all the complexities of life.
Okay, that makes sense. So it's about humility, like acknowledging our limitations and surrendering to something bigger than ourselves.
Exactly. And as we open ourselves to God's transforming love, we begin to experience that internal restoration. Our hearts change, our minds are renewed, and our relationships are healed.
Okay, but let's be realistic for a second. Life doesn't magically become perfect just because we embrace this new covenant right. We still face challenges and disappointments and setbacks.
Of course. The new covenant gives us a different perspective, to face those challenges. We're no longer defined by our circumstances, but by our identity as God's beloved children. We have his spirit within us, empowering us to persevere, to grow, and to find hope, even in the darkest of times.
I love that. So it's not about escaping hardship, but about walking through it with God by our side,
Yeah.
equipped with the strength and resilience to overcome.
That's precisely the message of hope that we find in Jeremiah 30:33. It's this reminder that no matter what we face, God is with us. He's working to restore us, to heal us, and to draw us into a deeper relationship with him.
Throughout these chapters, I've been struck by the imagery that's used to describe God's power and faithfulness. It's not just like these dry theological concepts. It's painted in this really vivid language.
You're right. That's one of the things that makes these chapters so captivating. The language is so rich with metaphors and symbolism.
Like in Jeremiah 31.12, for example, it talks about God's people coming to Zion with their faces radiant with joy. That's such a powerful visual. What do you make of that?
Well, it evokes this sense of wholeness, this overflowing happiness that comes from being in right relationship with God. It's this picture of restoration, not just for individuals, but for entire communities.
And then there's that striking image in Jeremiah 33.3, where God says, "Call to me, and I will answer you and tell you great and unsearchable things you do not know." It's like he's inviting us on this adventure of discovery, this journey into the depths of his wisdom. Do you think that invitation to call implies a certain posture or attitude that we should have when we're approaching God?
Absolutely. It implies this posture of humility and openness, a willingness to listen and to learn. God isn't simply dispensing information, but he's inviting us into a deeper relationship.
And sometimes those revelations come in unexpected ways. Just like when Jeremiah was told to buy that field during the siege. It seemed illogical at the time, but it became this profound act of faith and a symbol of God's unwavering promise.
You're right. It's this reminder that God's ways aren't always our ways. He sees the bigger picture, and he's always working for our good, even when we don't fully grasp his plans. Perhaps those unsearchable things aren't always meant to be fully grasped by our finite minds, but to be experienced through faith and obedience.
That's a really insightful perspective. It challenges me to think about how I approach my own relationship with God. Do I come with a sense of curiosity and wonder? Or am I trying to fit him into this box of my own understanding?
Those are great questions to ponder. I think that sense of curiosity and wonder is essential to truly experiencing God's presence and allowing him to work in our lives.
So if we were to kind of sum up the core message of these chapters, what would you say it is? What's the takeaway for our listener?
I think it's a message of hope that's grounded in God's unfailing love and faithfulness. It's a reminder that even when we're facing hardship and uncertainty, he is working to restore us, to heal us, and to bring us into a deeper relationship with him.
And that restoration is available to everyone, not just a select few. It's a promise that extends to all who choose to embrace the new covenant and walk in his ways. But as we've seen, restoration isn't just about passively waiting for God to fix everything. It involves our active participation, our willingness to surrender to his transforming love, and to walk in obedience to his word.
You're absolutely right. That's where the rubber meets the road, so to speak. It's about allowing God's grace to work in and through us, to shape our thoughts, our actions, our relationships. It's about taking the steps of faith even when we don't fully understand, like Jeremiah buying that field.
This has been an incredible deep dive so far, and I feel like we've only just scratched the surface of these really powerful chapters. We've been unpacking some pretty profound concepts from Jeremiah 30 through 33, prophecies and promises and this overarching theme of restoration. But how does it all make a difference for us, like in the here and now?
That's the question, isn't it? How do we take these ancient words and apply them to our modern lives?
It is. It's so easy to get caught up in the historical context and miss the timeless truth. That's just as relevant today as it was back then.
Right. So let's try to distill some practical takeaways from these chapters, things we can actually, put into practice in our daily lives.
I'm all for that. Where should we start?
Well, first and foremost, I think these chapters challenge us to kind of shift our perspective, to view our circumstances through the lens of God's promises.
So even when things are tough, when we're facing those times of trouble that Jeremiah talked about, we can still hold on to hope. We can trust that restoration is coming.
Absolutely. Remember, God isn't ignoring our pain. He sees our struggles. And he's actively working to bring about deliverance, even when we can't see it yet.
Okay, that's reassuring to hear. What else stands out to you?
Well, secondly, these chapters remind us that restoration isn't just about our outward circumstances. It's about an internal transformation as well.
Right, that whole idea of the new covenant being written on our hearts.
Exactly. It's about allowing God's love to reshape our thoughts, our attitudes, our very being. And that's a lifelong process. It's not just a one-time event.
It seems like it's less about achieving this spiritual perfection and more about just embracing that journey, of becoming more like Christ.
You hit the nail on the head. It's about surrendering to his transforming grace and allowing him to work in us and through us, not trying to do it all on our own.
This reminds me of Jeremiah buying that field. Even though it seemed crazy at the time, it was an act of obedience and trusting God's promises, even when circumstances seemed to contradict them.
It really was, and I think it's such a powerful example for us. We're called to step out in faith even when we don't have all the answers. And those acts of obedience, however small they may seem, can open the door to experiencing God's power in amazing ways.
So these ancient prophecies aren't just stories from the past, but they can have this very real impact on how we live our lives today. What else can we glean from Jeremiah's experience?
Well, here's another takeaway that I think is crucial. Never underestimate the power of prayer.
Yeah, that invitation in Jeremiah 33 to call to me was incredibly powerful. It felt so personal and intimate.
God desires to communicate with us, to reveal his wisdom and guidance. But we need to make space for that communication, to actively seek him through prayer.
Right. It's not just about asking for things, but about listening, about being open to hearing God's voice, even when it's unexpected or challenging.
Exactly. It's about cultivating a posture of humility and receptivity, a willingness to let God lead us even when we don't know where he's taking us.
I think this deep dive has given me a whole new appreciation for the book of Jeremiah. It's often associated with doom and gloom, but it's also filled with so much hope.
It is. And it's full of promises and a vision of restoration that goes far beyond the immediate context.
So as we wrap up, what's one thing you hope our listener takes away from our exploration of Jeremiah 30 through 33?
I would say this: no matter what challenges you're facing, no matter how bleak things may seem, never lose sight of God's unwavering love and his promise of restoration. He is with you. He is for you. And he is working all things together for your good.
That's a beautiful message of hope. And I would also add, don't be afraid to explore these chapters further on your own. Let God's word speak to you directly and see what treasures you uncover. You might be surprised by what you discover.
I completely agree. There's so much depth and encouragement waiting to be found in these scriptures, and it's our hope that this deep dive has sparked a desire in you to go even deeper.
Well, thank you for joining us on this journey through Jeremiah. Until next time, keep seeking, keep exploring, and keep diving deep into the things that matter.